This is Chris Casey, Managing Director at WindRock Wealth Management. Today we have the pleasure of being joined by the geopolitical analyst Eric Margolis, who is an author and an award-winning internationally syndicated columnist and war correspondent. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Times of London, and numerous newspapers throughout the world. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be back with you.
Well, let's start off with the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Turkey. And I don't know if we can really say this is unprecedented because we have frequent assassinations, throughout the world of journalists and dissidents, Russian, Palestinian, etc. But this seems exceptional given the evidence surrounding the murder. Are you surprised how much information has been gathered by the Turks?
Not overwhelmingly surprised, because the Turkish intelligence service, MTI, has a reputation for being very efficient and very comprehensive. And certainly one of the places they would have bugged is the Saudi consulate in Istanbul or Ankara. And so that's how they picked up this whole story.
Yeah, the evidence, though, that they have picked up, they seem like they've slowly been dribbling it out over the course of well over a month. Why are they doing this? Is it a form of blackmail, meaning we don't want to give everything up at once? We just want to give up enough so that the Saudis know that we do have the evidence? Is that what they're doing?
Yes, the Saudis are being very media savvy. I mean, the Turks are being media savvy in the sense, if they had let it all out at once, it would be yesterday's story by now. But by dribbling it out in bits, they've kept the media interested and kept the suspense involved. It's real Agatha Christie stuff.
Do you think they'll release it publicly eventually, where to really bring the pressure upon the Saudis?
They could. They could. Though the Saudis are frantically trying to appease the Turks now, probably offering them all kinds of things. Who knows how much money to keep the thing quiet. But Turks are very tempted to really stick it to the Saudis.
Yeah, you mentioned these concessions they're probably talking about. And obviously, the Turkey financial situation is not good, so they could certainly use the money. Are they also looking, do you think, for concessions in Syria or other areas?
Oh, probably. The Saudis and the Turks are at loggerheads over Syria, with the war still going on there. There are other regional issues like Kurds and Azerbaijan and oil pipelines in the Eastern Mediterranean. There are all kinds of opportunities for confrontation. And so Turks are proceeding very patiently, very slowly, which is not typically Turkish either. The Turks can tend to be hot-headed and not that patient, but this time they're playing it like the violin.
Yeah, and the one thing I don't know if they've released so far is actual evidence directly tied. I mean, certainly they've implicated the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, but I know the CIA has basically said that he's responsible, and I think the director of the CIA is testifying before Congress today, in fact, December 4th. But how likely do you feel it is that he was indeed responsible?
Oh, I think it's very likely. I think it's almost, dare I use this expression, a slam dunk. There's a fair amount of telecom information, a lot of calls going directly to the Crown Prince. We haven't heard anything yet with him in a recording saying, cut the guy's fingers off, but the communications point to that way. And if any of his aides were captured abroad and squeezed, they might also turn evidence against them.
Mm-hmm. Well, given the Crown Prince, MBS, as he typically goes by, his culpability, I'd imagine there's two reasons he may have done this. One is, on the one hand, there's the theory that Khashoggi was really somehow a threat. He privately insulted him via these text messages, calling him think it was Pac-Man because he gobbles up everything he sees. And there's some suggestions that Khashoggi was looking at distributing, SIM cards to dissidents. On the other hand, Khashoggi's been linked to other Saudi royal family factions, I believe the Abdullah clan. So how much of this was due to a perceived threat, whether or not it was really real, versus just some kind of intra-Saudi power struggle?
Well, I really don't understand. Khashoggi was a unimportant figure in the scope of things in the Middle East. He had been a faithful retainer of the royal family. He then fell out with the royal family, moved to the States, where he made gentle criticism of the royal family, nothing earth-shaking. And yet, for some reason we don't know yet, the Crown Prince decided it was time to do him in. He was so angry at him. But I've never seen anything that would have provoked that. This guy was a real mild-mannered, soft-spoken, middle-of-the-road journalist, also in his columns in the Washington Post, which was pretty well supportive of the Saudi royal family.
Could it just be as simple as a message that MBS is sending to the other factions, that basically demonstrating his unlimited power, or any other reasons he may do this?
Well, because there's no doubt that there are serious tensions within the royal family. We don't even know how many of these guys there are. There's some figures show them up to 14,000. Some say there are really only 2,000 influential members. Hard to tell. But there are these stresses, rivalries, and then there's stresses within Saudi Arabia between you want to call them liberals, between Shia Saudis. There's a lot of stuff going on there. And this was an aspect of it. However, MBS has a reputation, a well-earned one too, for being headstrong and incautious. He was considered very long a young hothead. That's what a lot of the other older Arab leaders would call him. He didn't command a great deal of respect, and he is noted for injudicious behavior and flying off what's the expression, flying off the bat? He's not a cautioned or seasoned statesman.
It sounds like he's kind of the Sonny Corleone of the Saudi family.
Good analogy, good analogy.
Well, he's also had a really rocky start to his career. And correct me if I'm wrong, he's really only been the crown prince for a year and a half, although maybe he had some de facto power before that. But, I mean, he has this disastrous war he launched in Yemen. He basically abducted and extorted around 500 relatives to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. He tried and I think largely failed to marginalize Qatar for reasons that are unknown to me. And he kidnapped the prime minister of Lebanon. A lot of really not just ineffective, but bizarre behavior. Do you think this latest situation of murdering this high-profile journalist will weaken his position further?
I think so, though I am not sure that it's weakened his position fatally. But it certainly won't make him any stronger. And but still, he counts. He may have lost support inside Saudi Arabia and in the royal family, but the crown prince still retains strong support from two of the big players there, which is the United States, President Trump, and from Israel, which is the secret ally of Saudi Arabia, or not so secret these days, and they want him to stay in power. So he should feel some reassurance.
We may be secure now, but I imagine there's another point in time where his authority can be challenged, and that's when his father, the current king, actually dies. And here's what strikes me as different about Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they've had this line of succession over the years where it goes from brother to brother. and this is the first time really where we're expecting the generational switch. And yet, kings throughout history are the law, but for one law, and that's the law of succession. But it seems like here they've even changed it, where not only are they deviating from going from brother to brother, but years ago they set up this allegiance council to pick the new crown prince for line of succession. But then that seemed like it was cast aside when they brought up MBS to begin with. So what is his position extremely weak when his father does indeed die?
Well, yes, he's being called an interloper and a usurper, to use fancy $5 words. He is, and a lot of people's noses are out of joint because the traditional succession has been violated badly. His father, the king, is suffering from cognitive problems. He's Alzheimer's. He's got something really bad. He's half out of it. And you're right. I don't think he's long for this world, poor man. So that has empowered his older son even more. I'm surprised that there hasn't been a move by the other princes to unseat him or to marginalize him or even to remove him completely.
You mentioned he has the external support of both Israel and certainly the White House under Trump. But it seems to me, I mean, we already mentioned the CIA implicating him. It seems like the deep state is against MBS and his ascension to the crown, which strikes me as strange, because you would think that they'd both be aligned, the White House and the deep state, sort of against Iran and looking to use MBS to that measure. What's going on, I guess, internally in America as it relates to these different factions supporting different the Saudi factions?
I don't know how the Saudis feature vis-a-vis the deep state. They supported the Saudis for a while, and now the deep state seems to have backed off after the murder of Khashoggi. They are not happy with the crown prince, and they're not happy with his ambitions to become the paramount ruler of the Middle East. We've seen too many of these overly ambitious but insufficiently competent people emerge in the past and want to be the big cheese in the Middle East. The deep state has not taken an overt position on this, but there's sort of unhappiness expressed behind the scenes.
So how do you see this playing out as it relates to American policy in the Mideast, whether it's Syria, Iran? How do you see kind of this power struggle playing out and in potentially changing their current plans?
Well, we Americans have had a tradition of supporting the wrong people in the Middle East, of supporting strongmen, despots, megalomaniacs like the Shah of Iran, who were eager to do our bidding for power reasons, but ended up doing a great deal of damage, hurting their own countries and turning them against the United States. So we like to deal with individual dictators because it's easy. You don't have to deal with different factions and parties, and then you just call Mr. Big in the palace, and he will agree with you and get things done. So we're doing it again with this crown prince in Saudi Arabia, where his other ally, his other big ally, is Field Marshal al-Sisi in Egypt, the dictator of Egypt, who we put into power after overthrowing the only democratically elected government in the history of Egypt. And we're going back thousands and thousands of years. The Morsi government, it was overthrown by the army with backing from the U.S. And Egypt is now turned into a very nasty dictatorship, worse than it was under the former dictator, President Mubarak. And we're going to have problems with Egypt, no doubt about it, but it is the most populous Arab country and can't be avoided in the Middle East. So here we are again, we're almost forcing ourselves to redo the mistakes of the past.
Right, and you could probably say it was the first democratically elected, non-Israeli Middle East country memory. Yeah. Are there any other geopolitical repercussions here, whether it's directly from the Khashoggi murder or any kind of Saudi power struggle? Can it come into play with kind of Russo-American relations? Over this recent G20 summit, I noticed that MBS and Putin were certainly cozying up to each other, and Saturday Night Live even did a whole skit on it. Do you see that playing a part somehow in American politics?
Well, Russia is being very cagey, and President Putin is a very astute operator. And he really knows the region too. I'm somewhat at a loss to understand his policy because he is really playing footsie with MBS in Saudi Arabia. As we saw, as mentioned at the summit, they looked like young lovers, and the Saudis, of course, are making all kinds of business deals with the Russians, and behind the scenes, investments, and they're cooperating in the oil business. Now, I think they just announced cutbacks in production. So the Russians are playing different sides of this game. Russia has a historic interest in the Mideast that goes back to the 19th century. Remember, the Russians declared themselves protectors of all the Mideast Christians. And the Russians are beating the drums now on Christianity. They become sort of born-again Orthodox Christians. And so this is a way of advancing soft Russian power in the Middle East is on the religious grounds. Russia sort of likes autocrats, and it is doing its best to have a finger in, if I can mix metaphors, in every pie in the Middle East, so that it keeps expanding its influence. It's doing the same thing with Israel. It's opposing Israel in Syria, for example, but in certain other areas, it is playing very cozy with the Israelis and with Israel's Mossad intelligence agency. And it's hard to tell whose side Russia is on.
Eric, just one final question. If we go back to the Trump and Israeli support of MBS, as a proxy of their power in the region, what do you see there being an eventual American-Iranian war using Saudi Arabia? How do you see this going down the road?
Oh, I do see a war coming. I've been writing about it for some time. The U.S. has been trying to provoke Saudi Arabia. The Israelis, Iran. The Israelis are eager to launch an air war against Iran. A incident in the Gulf is very likely between ships, both sides. So if the U.S. is so hostile and so belligerent towards Iran, look at Pompeo's last statement that was the most aggressive diplomatic statement I've seen since Austro-Hungary in 1914 delivered an ultimatum to Serbia, which was essentially said, roll over and die. And that is what the U.S. has said to Iran. The Iranians are not chickens by any means. They're saying, come and get us. But the U.S. has long, when I was last in the Pentagon, They told me that the U.S. has planned, I think it was 28,000 airstrikes, targets against Iran. That would be the opening act. So war is very close. And the idea in the Trump administration is this will remove the last impediment to Israel's total influence over the Middle East, and perhaps even expansion into some of the oil areas.
Well, Eric, for additional insights like this, where can people find your writings? Where can you direct them to?
They can find my website, which is www.ericmargolis, MARGOLIS.com.
Well, thank you for joining us today.